Hi there, my name's Mike Rogerson. I'm a lecturer in digital economy at Surrey Business School, and in this research snapshot we are going to be looking at blockchain for visibility and compliance. What we'll look to cover here is the contexts in which blockchain is being deployed, the problems that it seeks to solve, the technologies, because we're going to look at technology as well as blockchain, that are being deployed, a couple of case studies on how those technologies are being deployed, and the implications. So the contexts of the adoption of technologies for supply chain visibility are broadly legislative. In the UK, we have the UK Modern Slavery Act, and there are due diligence laws appearing around Europe in Norway, the Netherlands, Germany, and indeed across Europe in the form of European Union mandatory environmental and human rights due diligence legislation, and in the United States, which has instituted more targeted legislation against specific geographies for forced labour, but also specifically on forced labour. And in the American context, unlike other contexts, that legislation has been backed by action. So recently the US has banned imports of sugar from the Dominican Republic and banned Chinese fishing fleets for similar reasons, i.e. that they couldn't prove that forced labour wasn't used. And so we have this legislative background for companies adopting visibility technologies. So the problem really is that the responsibility for what goes on in supply networks, supply ecosystems, it has become legally the purview, the remit of the large companies in supply chains, so the focal firms. There is a requirement to know materials and goods provenance, largely because of the legislation that I've mentioned, but also in terms of conflict minerals legislation in the United States and the EU, which forces firms to know where their 3TG minerals, their tin, tantalum, tungsten and gold came from, to ensure that they've not come from conflict zones. And some of the problems that prevent visibility or inhibit visibility are that modern supply ecosystems are complex. We've been saying that for decades. It becomes increasingly so as time goes on. The multifaceted nature of human and environmental risks in supply networks is another factor, and the broad geographical spread of materials origin. If we think about a mobile phone, for example, the oil for the plastics, all of the metals, and many of the other components will have come from different continents, let alone different countries, and digging into the histories of all of those components is time consuming, is complex, is expensive. The result is that a 2016 study by Kim and Davis of US companies' responses to the United States conflict minerals provisions of the 2010 Dodd-Frank Act found that fewer than 1% of firms were compliant with that piece of legislation. Of over 1,300 firms in scope of the provisions, the conflict minerals provisions of that law, only 13 firms were very confident that they knew where their minerals had come from. Responses, partly because of the weakness of the UK Modern Slavery Act, but to the Modern Slavery Act in this country, are almost universally poor, and the top 100 EU firms' commitments to due diligence and the action that they disclose that they're conducting on due diligence is no better than the top 100 Russian firms, i.e. poor. Both of those studies I've conducted recently myself. So what are the technologies that organisations are adopting to try and overcome some of these difficulties? Well, the first is blockchain, a digital technology founded on a distributed ledger. So if we think about a traditional ledger in terms of a piece of paper that is just a simple list of transactions, it's effectively what a blockchain is in digital form. It acts as a shared repository of transactions, which is distributed, as the name suggests, among the participants in a supply network, meaning that there is a single source of truth, rather than every organisation tracking things for itself and making its own records. There is a single record which is cryptographically hashed, so that the security is cryptographic, i.e. extremely hard to break, and that provides security from external attack. The data that go into a blockchain are immutable, meaning that they can't be changed once entered onto a blockchain, making internal security a second priority. Even parties to the supply ecosystem can't change the data once they've been entered. And blockchain enables a collection of rich data along supply chains. So location data, as previous technologies such as QR codes and RFID tags, can be collected, but so can temperature data and specific other forms of data, to include who is working at specific sites, to include the type of visibility on geography that can come from satellite transponders rather than humans inputting data. And so we have much richer data that can be collected, photos, videos, etc. The second top technology that we'll look at very briefly today is novel biomarkers. And these are based on plant DNA. Just like you or I have different DNA, have different fingerprints, each plant has different DNA as well. And that's true for my, for example, cocoa farm and your neighbouring cocoa farm. The cocoa on our farms will have different DNA for a variety of reasons, whether there's a barrier in between our farms or not. Novel biomarkers allow for tracking of organic material, which bridges traceability issues, particularly in cocoa supply chains, where there are traceability gaps along the supply chain, which until this technology was trialled for this purpose had been unbridgeable. And the DNA traceability is not affected by the processing that goes on when, for example, chocolate is made. So let's have a look at the case studies that come out of these technologies. On the left we have a mine. I'm sure you can see that this is not the kind of natural state of the earth, and that mining is enormously environmentally degrading and brings with it significant human rights challenges. The case that we looked at is the case of MineSpider, a German blockchain company which enables Google, Cisco and Volkswagen to trace their tin, one of the conflict minerals featured in EU and US legislation, from Peru through supply networks and into China. And it does this by tracking individual shipments, but isn't necessarily done as a source of the truth as blockchain was designed, because that truth can remain open to question. What it does by having specific individual people enter the data is not so much tell you what is true, but tell you who is accountable for that truth. And that accountability can be checked at any time, enabling us to be more confident because of a reduction of the causes of fraud, for example. The second case we'll look at is child labour in West African cocoa farms. Now, DNA biomarkers collected in great enough quantity from a large enough number of farms can provide a database which tells us, whenever we check a chocolate bar bought in a shop in the UK, where those cocoa beans that went into the manufacture of that chocolate originated. Chocolate firms make large, loud claims to sustainability, but actually largely don't know where their cocoa comes from, and this can change that. The implications here are that both blockchain and novel biomarkers can provide supply chain visibility and efficiency. reduction of admin, for example, where blockchain is concerned. The drivers for visibility, however, are largely sociological. Efforts at visibility have relied on firms perceiving that this is what consumers want and that there is a competitive advantage to be gained from these efforts. But the barriers to adoption, and therefore to visibility, are broadly legislative. So the UK doesn't currently allow digital documentation of ship manifests, for example, shipping manifests. So even if firms want to pre-land their goods in a port in order to enhance efficiency and move the goods through the port once the boat eventually arrives, that can't be done yet. And we don't have strong legislation forcing companies for sustainability reasons to go about these activities. We have a Modern Slavery Act which has produced very little change, and other jurisdictions are gradually moving towards a form of due diligence which forces action rather than pure disclosure. The US being a case in point, and the upcoming European legislation hopefully being another one that will force action. And until that action is mandatory, adoption is also voluntary. Thank you very much. Does anyone have any answers?